Okay, this lecture is a predecessor lecture to our discussion on web protocols, and it's titled URIs, URLs, and URNs. So we need to understand these, or at least the URL portion, before we continue into our web discussions. So the first thing I want to talk about is what is a URI. A URI is a Uniform Resource Identifier. There are two different types of URIs, URLs and URNs, and their purpose is to specify how a resource can be located and accessed. These were originally developed in the 1990s. And a URI is divided into a URL and a URN. So a URL is Uniform Resource Locator, and a URN is a Uniform Resource Name. So a URL is a URI, a URN is a URI. So it's kind of a division between how they are used. A URL, like I said, is a Uniform Resource Locator, and the purpose of a URL is to specify a location on the internet. And if we have all the parts of a URL, its syntax looks like this, where the things in less than, greater than brackets, you substitute in what's explained. So what I'm going to do to make this a little easier is I'm going to go through and discuss the optional parts of a URL, what they are, and as we go, remove it to get down to a more simple syntax that we might be more familiar with or might be more commonly used. So the first one that I'm going to talk about and then get rid of is user:password. So if you're going to a website that requires authentication, you can put a user ID :password, and it will use that to authenticate you on the machine. So now that we know what that is, we're going to remove that. It is an optional part, as it states there, and our syntax becomes this, a little shorter. Next thing I want to talk about and remove is the fragment. The fragment is optional. If there's a pound sign at the end of the URL followed by a name, that is identifying an offset or location within a document. So you might say, go to this URL, pound sign CHAP1. So somewhere in that document there will be a label CHAP1, which maybe represents chapter 1 of the document. And what it'll do is your web browser will go to that page, and then it will scroll down to wherever that fragment is located in the document. So now that we know what a fragment is, if we remove it, our syntax becomes this. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is the query. The query is optional. A query is a set of key value pairs that are passed to a server-side script, which is code running on the server. If there are multiple key value pairs, then you separate them by an ampersand, an and sign. So here's an example of a query. I have my question mark, which tells me it's a query. F name equals Wayne and L name equals Beach. So presumably whatever URL I'm going to is a script, and I can set my first name by setting the variable or the key F name to, in this case, my first name, and L name, the last name, is Beach. So that's an example of passing two key value pairs into or placing them in the URL. So now that we know what a query is, if we get rid of the query, our syntax becomes this, much shorter. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the port. The port is optional. It is specified by putting a colon after the server name and then a numeric port. This is the port that is listening. So you have software running that is looking for connections on a specific port. Since URLs are primarily used for accessing websites, if you omit the port, it's going to default to port 80, which is the default port for HTTP. So now that we know what the port is, if we get rid of it, then we get down to kind of the simplest, or close to the simplest form of a URL, where you have a scheme, a host, and then a path of the information you want to look at. So you should be familiar with things like http://server.com/files/document.html. So there is a URL. The scheme is required. The host is required, and you may have a path. That path can be empty. If that path is empty, then it's going to go to the top level of that server. The path is technically optional. The host or the server is required. This is the server that you want to connect to access the document or program that you're looking for. And then the scheme is required. And in the example from the previous one, of course, the scheme was HTTP. So we're going to talk about a bunch of schemes starting on the next slide that you can have in a URL. So we've already talked about HTTP. This is a web page. Here's an example for students to get to my path on the KCTCS SharePoint server. We also have a scheme of HTTPS, which is a secure web access. So if we wanted to access the URL more securely, and the web server does support SSL, then you can use HTTPS : and then the rest of the URL. Another one is FTP. There used to be a site, you could say FTP://ftp.adobe.com, and it would connect you to Adobe's FTP server. A lot of browsers no longer support FTP:// just period say we don't support it. Other ones, instead of doing FTP through the browser, are going to open an application. For example, it might open an FTP client, a very popular one called CyberDuck. Continuing on with more schemes, some browsers support SFTP, not all of them. So I have an example from before, but you would just basically have SFTP:// server name, possibly path on that server. Mail to will send an email to a specific person. So if I type mail to in the browser, like I have here, wayne.beach@kctcs.edu, or if that appears in a web page, it will highlight as a link. And if I go to that URL or I click on that URL, it's going to open up my mail client, whatever the default mail client is on the machine, and start an email with the to field already populated with wayne.beach@kctcs.edu. Another protocol, which I may mention in the web server lecture, is kind of a predecessor to the web, which is Gopher. Gopher was created by the University of Minnesota. It kind of got its name, has two different meanings, kind of a play on word. First of all, University of Minnesota's mascot is a gopher. And then they were kind of a play on words of G-O space F-E-R. You know, go for this document, go for this item. So that became Gopher. And here's what an example URL accessing a Gopher server that presumably has recipes on it. Net news. This used to be how you shared information and discussed topics. Net news, like everything else, started out with a handful of groups and then has grown into the thousands, possibly I think the tens of thousands, like 30,000 news groups. But if you wanted to access it, there's actually two ways. You can use NNTP for the net news server, and that is when you want to go to a particular article that is on a particular server. The other scheme that you can use is news : news is also net news, but it specifies an article by message ID. So here's one I found in my email from a really long time ago, like the 80s or 90s, where there was a discussion at Microsoft regarded to Internet Explorer on Unix machines. Another scheme is Telnet. Some browsers will run Telnet in the browser. Other ones, similar to FTP, will open up an application that is capable of doing these. Looks like the next slide's a little bit out of order. So there is a file URL that accesses a file. An example is to give file : / a particular host / a path on that host to the file, and it will retrieve the file for you. And there are lots and lots of URLs or URIs schemes. So here is a URL where you can find a big list of those on Wikipedia. And then we have URNs, which again stand for Uniform Resource Name. A URN identifies a resource in a permanent way without really telling where that is located on the internet. So a URN starts with URN : you have something called a namespace identifier, which kind of tells what this URN is referring to. And then you have namespace specific stream, which is kind of sub-identifiers, if you will. I think the best way to kind of get a feel for these is to look at some examples. So the first one is a URN : ISBN. We'll talk about formal and informal identifiers here in a moment, but this is a formal one for identifying a book. There's also a formal identifier called IEEE, which refers to resources of the IEEE, which is the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. The sub-ID is standard, so this is a standard that IEEE published, and the specific standard is 802.3, which is Ethernet. We've talked about RFCs a little bit recently. RFCs are maintained by the Internet Engineering Task Force, the IETF. So this is referring to RFC 97. that was created by IETF. Amazon Web Services, Amazon's cloud offering, uses URNs. They actually have ARN, which is an Amazon resource name. So basically this is saying we're on AWS. I want to look at S3, which is bucket storage. And then, I might have my corporate bucket / a development subfolder, and I'm referring to star, which is the wildcard for everything. So everything in the development bucket. So there are lots of URNs. A list of formal URNs can be found at the IANA.org site. They're the people that, because these are things that have to do with names or numbers, they're maintained by IANA. So that's a relatively quick discussion of URIs, URLs, and URNs.